Hi, I'm Wendy Turner, Executive Director of Michigan Public. You might have heard that public media is under threat. You're not wrong. But I come to tell you that your voice has power. Visit protectmypublicmedia.org, contact your lawmakers, and take a stand today.
From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
I'm Rick Pluta. A Republican and a Democrat took the stage last night, debating the issues, looking for votes.
But no, it was not the vice presidential debate. It was rather two candidates in a northern Michigan state House seat in a race that could determine whether Democrats keep control of the state House and hence their trifecta in Lansing. We will talk with the moderator of that debate about what happened and the impact it will have in Lansing coming up.
But first,
I stand here asking to be your vice president with extraordinary gratitude for this country, for the American dream that made it possible for me to live my dreams.
So this is about trying to understand the world. It's about trying to do the best you can for your community.
vice presidential candidates Tim Walz and J.D. Vance took the stage last night in New York.
In what's largely being billed as respectful in tone and focused on policy, it was the first and only scheduled VP debate of the 2024 election. Stephen Henderson is the host of WDET's Created Equal. He has moderated many a debate. And Andrea is principal at Bitely Communications. She has staffed many a candidate preparing for high-stakes debates. Hi, you two.
Hello.
Hello.
So, okay, the first rule of debates at this level, do no harm, right? At least not to your ticket, particularly if you have the advantage going in. Do nothing that is going to distract from your momentum. Was that achieved last night?
Yes. Neither candidate did anything that was completely insane.
Which is like a low bar.
Which was a low bar.
But it's kind of with this vibe election, kind of true.
It was a very low bar for them going into it on both sides. J.D. Vance just needed to be normal, and Tim Walz needed to not look like he was going to throw up the entire time. They both achieved that goal pretty well, I think.
Stephen?
I actually would go further. I think they did a remarkable job, both of them, of showing the country what an actual substantive adult conversation about our differences could look like. I mean, there was a lot of substance in the debate. They drilled down on a lot of different policy issues, way more so than you saw in the presidential debate. They showed empathy for each other, like personal empathy for each other, which I about fell out of my seat when that happened. And they were civil the whole time. I mean, they were respectful of each other's positions, saying, "Look, I don't agree with this, but I do." You know, they actually talked about agreeing on things, right. And then pointing out the distinctions. I think this was one of the best debates I've seen in a really long time. I was really pleased.
Politico and NBC had headlines and commentary that described it as very Midwestern. Night of Midwest Nice was NBC's headline.
Right. I'm surprised afterwards they weren't sharing hot dish.
They might have.
They might have afterwards gone out.
Stephen, let's talk particularly about Michigan and the 6 other swing states that will in all likelihood determine the outcome of the presidential election. How much of this debate do you think focused on undecided voters versus getting the message out to the base and to excite those voters to go and get out and vote?
When you're talking about undecided voters at this point, you're likely talking about, what people call low information voters. I think that's probably a term that's too dismissive, but I think I would describe them as people who are not sitting around and just consuming everything about the race and the candidates all the time. They're trying to get as much information, as they can just to make a decision. And I'm not sure that a debate like this quite rises to their consciousness, right? I'm not sure it comes across their radar. I think both candidates were trying to make the case that, hey, even if you don't agree with my party and its fundamental beliefs, the things we want to do will be better for you. And J.D. Vance in particular, I think, had a real challenge in doing that. distancing himself from some of the more extreme parts of the Republican platform. Tim Walz had a little easier job with that because I think their message is pointed more at the middle. But I think the question again is how many of those voters are paying attention to something like that? And back to sort of Andrea's point, which was the goal for both was to do no harm. The only way they would get the attention maybe of those voters is if they had done something colossally stupid or obnoxious. And then it would have been everywhere and they would have seen and it could have changed their minds. But I'm not sure that this is a real data point for people who are still not sure what they want to do, but are also not terribly focused on just trying to get as much information as is out there all the time. This probably just kind of escaped them.
So the two were asked about abortion, immigration, gun safety, and we should note that included a reference to the Crumbly case here in Michigan. Also, healthcare, democracy. Andrea, if you are watching this and you are an undecided voter in Michigan, what resonated?
I think a few different pieces resonated. I think the abortion discussion resonated. We have a constitutional amendment that allows for women to make their own choice. And you saw J.D. Vance moving towards the middle on that, even though he previously had been ardently pro-life. He talked about being pro-family rather than saying he's pro-life, which is not a typical Republican talking point at all. You hear Republicans going full bore into pro-life. Vance talked about Republicans not being trusted on abortion. And that was a very interesting discussion, definitely pivoting towards the center, definitely moving towards what especially women who are likely going to be one of the major deciders in this election are thinking about in this very moment. I think the democracy question was very interesting as well. Walz pushed Vance on democracy, looked him in the eye-ish and said, did Donald Trump win in 2020? And Vance then did this little fancy dance to try to get around saying whether Trump won or lost. I think that is going to be the piece that sticks around from this debate. Harris has already cut an ad using that bit of commentary with footage from January 6th tied in with that soundbite.
And Andrea, to that point, and Stephen was talking about this, how many folks are actually watching a vice presidential debate at this moment? We'll get the Nielsen ratings later. But so much about this election is the sort of quote unquote social media vibe election. What are the moments from this debate that are going to stick and last through Election Day?
Yeah, that democracy moment, I think, will stick and last for at least a few days. But when those Nielsen ratings come back, I think we're going to find what those of us that are listening right now already know. This was not a highly watched event. This was an event that those of us that are super watchers of politics paid attention to, but the average person is probably just annoyed that Dancing with the Stars wasn't on last night.
That is Andrea Bitely, principal at Bitely Communications. Stephen Henderson is also here, host of WDET's Created Equal. So the candidates post-debate are now descending on the state this week. Vance here today. Trump in Saginaw tomorrow. Harris reportedly in both Flint and Detroit on Friday. Stephen, post-debate, what do these locations tell us about the strategy of both campaigns right now and moving forward?
Well, first, let me also say that I was disappointed that Dancing with the Stars.
You know what? That's why I just went right to this question. I didn't want to have to delve into the emotional depths of what that meant for you.
Yeah, but next week it'll be back. I think the swing states obviously are just the critical part of the race at this point. I mean, we are going to see these candidates over and over and over here in Michigan because both sides believe they have to have it in order to win. I happen to think that Michigan probably is not as close as some of the polls suggest. I think that there will be overvotes in places like Detroit because you have a Black woman on the ticket. The only two times I've ever waited in line to vote in Detroit were in 2008 and 2012, and I waited more than an hour both times in the Obama elections, and I waited in line behind Black women. And I think the idea that surge won't happen this time in 2024 is probably naive. I think you will see Black women mobilize in Detroit and other cities in a way that will probably overwhelm lots of other kinds of dynamics. If everything else is equal, that surge probably hands the state to Harris the way it did to Biden in 20. But the polls, of course, suggest that it is close. And so they're going to be here, and they're going to be in the places where each of them thinks they either have weakness in the middle or where they've got to shore up the base. You won't see a lot of reaching, I think, to try to take from the other side. Really, it is about getting that undecided voter and making sure that your base turns out. You know, the number of times Kamala Harris has already been here during this cycle suggests how focused she is on that vote in Detroit and Black voters in Detroit, which of course are overwhelmingly female voters in the city. This is going to be a marathon. It's actually, it's actually pretty exciting to be able to see and hear them as much as I think we will.
Andrea, what do you think about that?
I think it's a huge combination of both, and also working on where they can have some coattail effect. This Flint visit could be as much about McDonald Rivet and Young in that race, trying to get McDonald Rivet over finish line. We know that's a very close race as well. And I think the John James Karamolinga race is also a focus for both of these campaigns. Both of them want to bring their party to DC to control as much as they can. And so there's a lot going on here in our state, and every visit from either Harris Walz or Trump Vance gets people a little more motivated and visible.
Andrea Bitely, principal at Bitely Communications, and Stephen Henderson, host of WDET's Created Equal. Go back to Dancing with the Stars. Thank you for your service.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So as we've talked about here on It's Just Politics, there are about 10 toss-up seats up for election this year that will determine the makeup of the Michigan State House, and thus the control of that chamber will determine whether or not Democrats hold complete control in Lansing for another 2 years. So the candidates for one of those seats met last night.
The Republican and the Democrat in a debate in northern Michigan, Glen Arbor, about 30 miles northwest of Traverse City, for the traditional so-called cherry pie debate.
Ed Ronco is the news director at our partner Interlochen Public Radio and was co-moderator. Hey, Ed.
Hey, how you doing?
First, Ed, we should note that this debate is not about cherry pie.
No, but there is cherry pie, which makes it all the better. It's a delicious debate.
The debate is happening and people are eating cherry pie?
Yes, literal cherry pie. In fact, one of the organizers of the debate was there. He's a candidate for a county office. He founded the debate back in the day, years and years ago. And he said one of the things they were thinking is that it's easier for people to come together over food. They listen to each other more, even if it's only because their mouth is full of pie and they have to chew.
Genius. Just genius.
So, Ed, introduce us to the two candidates here, a Democratic incumbent and a Republican challenger.
That's right. We've got Betsy Kofia, state representative seeking a second term. 2 years ago, she flipped the district by less than 1,000 votes. So this is a very competitive seat here. The challenger, Lisa Trombley, Republican, grew up downstate, as we call it here in the north, grew up in southern Michigan, went to Washington, D.C. for her career for about 30 years, government contracting work, and retired back to Michigan, was the chair of the Grand Traverse County Republican Party during the 2022 cycle, and is now seeking this state office.
Ed, as you note, this district represents northwestern parts of lower Michigan, so agriculture, climate change, big local issues. What did the candidates have to say?
Yeah, climate change was a big difference between the two of them. That was obviously one of our primary questions. Lisa Trombley got the question first and said that, she would not have climate change on the top of her agenda. She said, I'm probably not going to do much on this topic. She says science differs on what it believes about climate change. We, of course, had to fact check that a little bit. We know that scientists are in pretty wide agreement that human-caused climate change is happening. Kofia, on the other hand, she cited Hurricane Helene and how hurricanes are becoming bigger and stronger because of climate change. And that's obviously costing a lot of money. So when opponents of dealing with climate change say, well, it's too expensive to do it, she says it's actually more expensive not to deal with it. And so here in Michigan, it's a top priority for her. She said that because of the work the state has done already on climate change, for example, the governor's climate plan, adopting that, Michigan now is in a position to draw billions in federal infrastructure money that can help them move forward and become more carbon neutral, cleaner energy. So for Kofia, this was a top of the list agenda item.
Another local environmental energy issue of statewide importance there is Enbridge Line 5. What did you hear last night?
The Line 5 answers, it was actually the very first thing we asked. What's your position on how the legislature and state should move forward with this? It was kind of a restatement of what we already know, that the plans to bury the line underneath the Straits of Mackinac are controversial. Lots of concern over what a spill could mean for the Great Lakes. But ultimately, even Kofia said, the state legislature doesn't really have jurisdiction over this. This is not something we can really do much about, that it's more a federal government and a treaty issue.
Ed, whenever we're up north, we continually hear about the issue of housing and housing affordability. It's an issue across the state. What did the candidates have to say about that?
Yeah, housing's a big, big deal up here. It's gotten more and more expensive to live here, prohibitively so for a lot of folks who have moved farther and farther out of, say, Traverse City, but have to come into work. I mean, it's odd to have a smaller community like Traverse City facing sort of the similar issue to a larger city like Seattle or San Francisco, where people have to get farther away to afford it. So Kofia talked a lot about using money from visitors to fund local ideas, local investments. For example, she says she supports a bill package right now that would let the state tax vacationers and then put money from short-term rentals toward building housing for the permanent workforce, pay for infrastructure, pay for public safety. Trombley, a little different. I mean, they were both in a lot of agreement that housing needs to be dealt with and promptly. But Trombley's stance is basically that Lansing can't solve the problem alone. This is not a silver bullet thing that can come from the state capital, but that the legislature could move forward with expanding some of the utilities, some infrastructure, so that whatever housing the private sector builds on top of that would be that much more affordable. What's clear, though, from the conversation last night is that whoever ends up in this seat in Lansing after the election will definitely be paying attention to housing.
As we've mentioned, Democrats have a very slim majority right now in the state house. How much did the challenger, Lisa Trombley, focus on Republican ideas and policy versus, being an opposition figure, a no vote when it comes to Democratic policies?
Yeah, I don't know that her focus was so much on I'm here to thwart the Democratic agenda in Lansing. I think she was very focused on the policies that she wants to support, her stances on particular issues. It was Representative Kofia who emphasized the slim majority, especially around the issue of reproductive rights and abortion, saying that, it's this slim Democratic majority that's at stake that could dramatically change the picture for that issue here in Michigan. But that was kind of the only place that the larger picture of who controls Lansing was explicitly discussed. Most of the conversation was about issues pertinent to the folks in the room who were eating pie and listening to what's going on in northern Michigan.
Ed Ronco, news director at our partner Interlochen Public Radio. Ed, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Come have some pie sometime.
Oh my gosh, we're so there. And that is an all-debate edition of It's Just Politics for today. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.